The airline staff tried to block a black woman from escorting a fallen soldier. They tried to deny her the respect she deserved. What happened next shook the nation. You won't believe how this story ends. Stick around and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Colonel Naomi Jackson walked through the bustling airport terminal, her posture erect, her shoulders squared. Her dress uniform was immaculate, medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights, each one representing a chapter of sacrifice and honor. But today, the weight on her chest wasn't from the ribbons or stars. It was from the mission she was on. The solemn duty of escorting the remains of Private First Class Malik Thompson, a young soldier who had given his life in service to his country. This wasn't the first time Naomi had performed this duty, but it was the first time the fallen soldier was someone she knew, a young man she had mentored, watched grow from a bright-eyed recruit into a dedicated warrior. Today, she carried Malik's spirit with her, determined to fulfill the promise made to every soldier: no one gets left behind. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping up to the airline counter. Naomi had been through this routine before. She laid her military orders and identification on the counter with practiced precision. The agent behind the desk barely looked up, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the keyboard. For a brief moment, Naomi was invisible, just another body in line. But then the agent's eyes lifted, her gaze moving from Naomi's face to her uniform. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of discomfort, a shift in posture, the tightening of her lips. Naomi saw it clearly, the unspoken question lingering in the woman's eyes. How did someone like you earn all of that? The agent's smile was tight, her professionalism a thin veneer barely concealing her unease. Ma'am, could I see those documents again? Her voice was polite but rigid, controlled. Naomi handed them over once more, her face expressionless, her eyes steady. She watched as the woman examined each paper, her fingers grazing the military insignia, the official stamps. The hesitation was slight, but Naomi didn't miss it. She was used to this. The silent questioning, the suspicion lurking behind polite smiles. It was a look she had seen her entire life. Each step forward had been met with skepticism, each achievement scrutinized more harshly because of her skin color. Today was no different. The agent's eyes flicked to her colleague, Mark Reynolds, a man with a stiff posture and a face that seemed permanently set in a frown. There was a brief exchange, a silent conversation in glances and body language. The agent's smile was gone when she looked back at Naomi. Her voice was firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. You won't be able to board at this time." A chill ran through Naomi, cold and sharp, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. This is a military assignment. Everything is in order." The agent's gaze faltered, if only for a moment. But she quickly recovered, her voice flattening into rehearsed professionalism. "I understand, but it's policy, security protocol." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. What policy prevents a military officer from fulfilling their duty? There was no answer, only a flicker of discomfort in the agent's eyes as she looked away, her posture stiffening. Naomi felt the familiar sting of injustice, the unspoken reason hanging between them. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about protocol. It was about her. Behind Naomi, the line was growing. People shuffled, restless and curious, their eyes flicking toward the scene unfolding before them. Naomi refused to back down. She had faced worse than this. She had stood in hostile territories, led soldiers into battle, made life or death decisions under unimaginable pressure. This was just another battlefield, one where the enemy was ignorance dressed in bureaucracy. The agent's discomfort grew as the silence stretched. Naomi didn't look away, didn't break the silence. She was a soldier. She knew the power of holding your ground. The agent turned to her colleague. "Mark, could you help me with this?" Her voice wavered, just a bit. Mark's face was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes were cold as he stepped forward. He looked Naomi up and down, his gaze lingering on her medals, her insignia, her skin. "Ma'am, are you sure these documents are authentic?" Naomi's eyes narrowed. Her voice was low, controlled. "Excuse me?" Mark's expression remained unchanged. "We've had incidents before," he said, his tone neutral, with falsified military documents. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. It was an insult wrapped in politeness, a dagger concealed in procedure. Naomi felt anger sparking in her heart, but she didn't let it show. She stood perfectly still. Her voice was ice cold when she spoke. "My documentation is verified by the Department of Defense. If you have any questions, you can contact them directly." Mark's jaw twitched, his confidence faltering for a moment before he regained his composure. "I'll need to verify this. Please wait here." He walked away, leaving Naomi standing at the counter. She felt the stares, the whispers, the judgment pressing in from all sides. But she didn't move. The minutes dragged by, heavy and slow. Naomi stood tall, her chin high. But the whispers around her grew, swirling like a storm, carrying words that stung like shards of glass. Why are they giving her a hard time? She's in uniform. I've never seen them do this to a soldier before. She must have done something wrong. But the one that cut deepest was the voice that muttered, "Probably fake. You know how they try to scam the system." Naomi's chest tightened, the familiar burn of injustice searing through her. But her face remained impassive, her stance unyielding. She had heard it all before, the doubt, the suspicion, the assumption that she didn't belong in the uniform she wore. She had heard it when she became the first black woman to lead her battalion, when she received her medals for bravery, when she stood at the podium, delivering orders with authority. It never mattered how much she accomplished. She was always seen as an outsider. She wouldn't break. Not today. Not here. A voice broke through the noise, firm and steady. "This doesn't sit right with me." Naomi turned to see an older man stepping out of the line. His back straight, his face hard. His USMC cap was worn, the letters faded but unmistakable. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set. He looked at Naomi, his expression softening with respect. "Ma'am, are you escorting a fallen soldier?" Naomi's voice was firm. "Yes, Private First Class Malik Thompson. I'm taking him home." The man's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. He turned to Mark, who had just returned, his face pale, his posture rigid. "Then why is she being denied?" Mark's mouth opened, his words stumbling out. "It's security protocol." The man's eyes narrowed, his voice rising. "Protocol? I've escorted my brothers home, and not once did they ever question my orders. Not once did they question my rank. What's different today?" Mark's face flushed, his confidence faltering. We just need to verify." The man's voice grew louder, cutting through the air. "Verify what? Her rank? Her service? Or her right to stand where she's standing?" The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Naomi felt a tightness in her chest, a fierce gratitude for this man who spoke the words she could not. Mark's face turned white, his shoulders curling inward. He looked at Lisa, whose eyes were wide with panic, her hands frozen over the keyboard. They were losing control of the narrative, the power slipping from their grasp. The older man turned to the crowd, his voice strong and clear. Would this be happening if she were white? Silence. The truth echoed through the terminal, reverberating through every corner. The crowd was frozen, their faces reflecting the shock, the shame, the realization of what they were witnessing. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face turned crimson, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. Naomi stood firm, her head held high, her dignity intact. She was no longer alone. The man met her gaze, his eyes softening. He gave her a nod, a gesture of solidarity, of respect. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Then, the unmistakable click of a camera cut through the air. A young woman stood nearby, phone raised, her face set with purpose. "This isn't right. People need to see this," she said, her voice steady and clear. The ripple effect was instant. Phones appeared, held high as passengers began recording. In that moment, Naomi realized she was no longer standing alone. She was at the center of something much larger, a public reckoning. A man in his 50s crossed his arms, his face twisted in anger. A colonel in uniform being denied? This doesn't add up. His voice broke the spell of silence. Heads turned, faces hardened, eyes narrowing. People were connecting the dots, understanding the unspoken reason behind the denial. Mark's face flushed as he saw the phones pointed at him. His shoulders sagged, his posture faltering. He looked to Lisa, whose hands trembled over the keyboard. Their authority was slipping, the power dynamic shifting. The young woman's phone was trained on Mark. "Why is she being denied?" she demanded, her voice unyielding. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. His gaze flicked to Naomi, then back to the growing sea of cameras. The narrative was no longer his to control. Naomi's chest tightened, but she remained composed. The people were seeing it for what it was. They were speaking the truth she had been forced to live with her entire career. The young woman raised her voice. "Would this be happening if she were white?" The question was a verdict. It echoed through the terminal, irrefutable and damning. Mark's face contorted with shame, his authority crumbling. Naomi didn't move. She didn't have to. The truth was laid bare, and the people had taken up the fight. A man near the back shook his head, his voice hard. "This is wrong. She deserves respect." A woman crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. They wouldn't dare do this to a white officer. The older man in the USMC cap stepped closer, his voice sharp. "You don't question her rank. You question her skin." The truth landed like a blow. Mark's shoulders slumped, his face falling as the words sank in. He looked at Naomi, his eyes flicking over her uniform, her medals, her skin. Then he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The young woman's phone buzzed. She looked down, her eyes widening. It's viral. #Leatherfly is trending. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man held up his phone, his voice rising. People are calling for a boycott. Then, a voice pierced the chaos, cold and commanding. Colonel Jackson. The terminal fell silent. A man in a navy blue suit approached, his stride purposeful. His ID badge read, Major Samuel Carter, Department of the Army. His face was set, his eyes steely as he looked at Mark. This situation is now under military jurisdiction. Step aside. Mark's face drained of color. He stumbled back, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked at Lisa, but she was already shrinking away, her eyes wide with fear. Major Carter turned to Naomi, his expression softening. Colonel, the Pentagon has arranged a private military flight. You will not be flying commercial. Gasps rippled through the crowd, shock washing over their faces. Naomi felt the weight lift from her shoulders, relief flooding through her. She stood straighter, her voice steady. Understood, Major. Major Carter's eyes softened, respect evident. Let's go, Colonel. Your transport is ready. Private Thompson will receive the honor he deserves. As Naomi walked away with Major Carter, the ripple effect was immediate. The videos taken by witnesses spread across social media, igniting a firestorm of outrage. The #Leatherfly trended within hours, capturing national attention. News outlets picked up the story, the headlines unyielding, Black female colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier, nation outraged. Public backlash was swift and unforgiving. Veterans organizations condemned the airline's actions. Politicians demanded accountability. Calls for boycotts surged, and the airline's stock value plummeted. Under pressure, the company issued a public apology, placing Mark and Lisa on administrative leave. But the damage was irreversible. They faced lawsuits alleging racial discrimination and a failure to honor service member protections. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. For Naomi, this wasn't about the headlines. It was about honoring Private First Class Malik Thompson. She stood with his family as they received his flag-draped casket, their faces etched with grief and gratitude. She had kept her promise. Malik was brought home with dignity. His mother held Naomi's hands, her voice breaking. You brought him home with honor, thank you. Naomi's chest tightened, but she stood firm. He deserved this honor. He earned it. She looked at the casket, her resolve unshakable. Malik had given his life for this country. His sacrifice would not be overshadowed by prejudice. Days later, Naomi stood before her desk, a commendation letter from the Department of the Army in her hands. It recognized her courage, both in service and in standing up against injustice. The closing line resonated deeply. You honored the fallen with dignity, and you stood for justice with integrity. We salute you, Colonel Naomi Jackson. She placed the letter next to her medals, a testament to battles fought on and off the field. But the true victory was in the voices that had risen with her, in the legacy of courage she had helped inspire. Justice isn't just about what's right, it's about refusing to stay silent. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced unfair treatment? Share your perspective in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going and stand together against injustice. Your voice makes a difference.